So hello folks, welcome to the CIA Part 3 session, which particularly relates to the workstation and database. But before proceeding further, we need to analyze this very particular thing in mind as to what is the purpose or the sole motto because of which we are going to have our discussion in the curriculum of Certified Internal Auditor. Straight away, let's go to the slide number 3. From the perspective of auditors. So why is it essential for an auditor to review the workstation? And if we particularly talk about the workstation of the client, what does that mean? That means all the input controls of the client, the PCs, desktop, laptops, and the output of the client, and the associated hardware or the software which is used. So all these are part of the workstations. Why is it made a part of the curriculum? For the simple reason, an auditor is supposed to check the client books of accounts and give the opinion in context of it as to whether it depicts the true and fair view as far as the external auditor is concerned. But technically speaking about the internal auditor, he need to check the loopholes in the internal control system, right? And that on a perpetual basis for a continuous period of time. And just to have a fair amount of understanding for the same, he needs to first have a clear picture with respect to concomitant with the hardware controls, and that too in all the different ways with respect to the client for which the internal audit operations are going to be carried out. Let's take an instance this way, and then we will proceed accordingly step by step. If we talk about the policy and procedure review, what does that mean? Obviously, whatever the standards which have been stipulated by the industry, right, or the prevailing standards. Obviously, let's take an instance this way. There is a software company, and the name of that software company is Thomas Private Limited. The Thomas Inc. Let's take an instance this way. It's the Thomas Inc. company, right? And it particularly deals in the software. So a separate person is appointed to carry out the internal audit operations for this Thomas Inc. Let's name that person Mr. I. So Mr. I has been assigned the task for the same to carry out the internal audit operations of the Thomas Inc. Now, the first and foremost thing is that before proceeding further, he should have a clear understanding of the client, that means Thomas Inc., and its environment as such, within which it particularly operates, right? Technically speaking, as the point in question for which we're talking about, so the auditors, they actually assess what? The existence and adequacy of the policies and procedures as per the industry norms, right? For example, if the guidelines have already been stipulated by the government to use a particularly specification with respect to the software or the hardwares which are ought to be used by the software companies, right? So that the environmental is not doesn't get polluted as such. So these kind of specifications ought to be adopted by that organization, and the current ongoing organization in question is the Thomas one, right? So it is ought to be adopted by Thomas. All right. So the point makes sense. What sense? As to it needs to comply with the guidelines which are stipulated by the government, by the industry standards. Okay. So these guidelines have already put in place by the senior management, by the board of directors of this Thomas Inc. But if you talk about this Mr. I, who is an internal auditor for Thomas Inc., he first need to have a clear understanding with respect to the workstations of this Thomas Inc., as to what kind of specifications are involved as such, right? And accordingly, he will take his further steps because they ought to be carried out on a perpetual basis, on a continuous basis. So let's come to that point again. So we can say Workstations are what? They belong to the hardware component of the IT system infrastructure. And let me tell you, why are these important? Why we are emphasizing on this? Because we know this thing very well. And continuing with this example itself, okay. So the auditor, he used certain kind of audit softwares as well from time to time, right? Certain kind of softwares. So before having a particularly clear understanding with respect to the audit of these hardware, systems, he need to have a clear cut understanding of the input, output, and hardware. So you were supposed to remember three terminologies from the perspective of MCQ: input, output, and hardware, right? Input plus output controls plus hardware. Input, output plus hardware. I repeat one more time: input and output and hardware, for having a clear-cut picture with respect to the workstations of the client for which the audit operations are going to be carried out. Obviously. So once he gets a clear understanding, the specifications, the models, the system around which it evolves, it works. So accordingly, he gets a clear understanding for the same. And after having a clear understanding, obviously the operations can be streamlined for a perpetual period of time by making a consistent effort kind of approach, so that all the audit operations can be carried out effectively by that very particular internal auditor and his team there too. So proceeding further with the example, so the auditors, they assess the existence and adequacy of the policies and procedures as to whatever the controls they have been implemented by the organization, they are up to the mark or not, whatever the hardware system is there. And if we particularly talk about even the disposition of that system, let's come back to this very particular example of Thomas Inc. Later on, let's say all the system, they are outdated, they are redundant as of now, and they're not supposed to be used, right? So these are ought to be disposed of, right? So what are the policies stipulated by the government, by the environmental authorities as such, which are supposed to be kept in mind before disposing of these? So is this also the responsibility of the internal auditor? The answer is yes, right? So if an internal auditor is supposed to carry out his operations in a very effective manner, and when I say effective, so there are three terminologies which you are supposed to keep in your mind. The one term is efficiency. Another term is effectiveness, so that you don't land up in a confusing state of mind. So just to avoid the perplexity and ambiguity for the same. And the next one is the economy. If we talk about the efficiency, right? That means what? You have, as such, streamlined your operations. What does that mean? Your operations are carried out in an effective manner. You have streamlined your operations. Operations are streamlined. Everything is up to the mark as far as the operational efficiency, operations are concerned, right? You have streamlined your operations. But if you talk about effectiveness, that means as a whole, when your organizational goals, they are aligned. I will, incorporate some examples also for each of these three terminologies there too. But let's talk about the intricacies associated with them as of now first. So effectiveness, that means organizational goals are aligned. And if we talk about economies, that means reduction in the cost. I will throw an example one by one so that things become more clear to you. If I talk about economy, so let me tell you, suppose there is a shortage of stock. In an example, let's take an instance this way. There is a shortage of stock in an organization. Okay, there is a shortage of stock. How to deal with it? Let's specify the quantum as well. That amounts to $1 lakh. If you particularly feel like, okay, $1 lakh, it's a quite huge organization. It has got gigantic operations, and 1 lakh is just the shortage of stock amount. So if the separate person is appointed to carry out the operation just to avoid the shortage of stock, so let's say the salary of that very particular person it amounts to $70,000, right? Still, if we particularly talk about, is this operation, is this hiring referred to as the economy kind of terminology? Does it falls under that perspective? So the answer is yes. Obviously, if we make the cost benefit analysis, you are saving, because by just incurring $70,000, so 1 lakh shortage of stock is reduced to the optimum level, let's say it is almost nullified. So obviously you save $30,000, right? So that means economy mean to say cost benefit or reduction of cost kind of thing. Okay. So now the things are clear as far the economy term is concerned. If we talk about the effectiveness, obviously, let's take another instance this way. You have an organization and you are supposed to, expand your operations. You are going to undertake one more project. So there is an organization, Aman Inc. Okay. So this organization has already worked for a decade. Now it's high time it's planning to, set up other project for which, it is carrying out the project inflows for the future course of time and everything associated with that. But the foremost thing is that it is going to set up separate factory, a new factory, a new plant for this. And this thing is already stipulated beforehand. So there might be some, pollution because of the setting off of this factory. And if the pollution exceed the amount of the limits which have been already been stipulated by the government of that very particular country. So you cannot exceed this much particular pollution limit, otherwise there will be penalty and there is a possibility the operations may also be shut down. So just to consider these things, you have already set up a separate equipment or a plant, you have already a separate equipment which is particularly involved in minimizing this pollution, so that your project in the future course of time doesn't get shut down. So this is what you have aligned your controls with the organizational objectives as such. This is what, and this you have incorporated everywhere as a whole in the organization there too. This is effectiveness. And if you particularly talk about the efficiency, so this is with respect to, streamlining your operations. You have incorporated certain kind of internal controls in the organization. For example, segregation of duties. So earlier there used to be one person who used to carry out each and every, function which was supposed to be, related with this. If we particularly talk about this thing, invoicing part, but now there is a separate person for making invoices, for checking it, and finally giving an approval and placing order, whatever the future steps are involved. So separate persons are there. So this is referred to as streamlining of the operations. Now, I believe as far as these terminologies are concerned, if we particularly talk about the efficiency, if we particularly talk about the effectiveness and the economy, so they are made clear to you. Now let's proceed further so that the other things can also be discussed that way. So that means it is the responsibility of even the internal auditor to assess as to whatever policies and procedures they have been defined by the organization associated even with the workstations, that is your hardware, how you acquire it, what kind of hardware is acquired, what will happen when you will be going to disposed of in the future course of time. So the guidelines are supposed to be as per the industry specific compliances, right? You cannot as such cause pollution to the environment. You cannot simply just dump your garbage hardware in the environment. So can it be recycled? So lots of things associated with that. So this is the reason why, even from the perspective of an internal auditing function, internal audit activity there too, why the workstations play a crucial role to be studied by the internal auditing team and its leader, who is maybe referred to as chief audit executive or the director of internal audit or the vice president of the internal audit team. Proceeding further, let's take one more example. If we talk about the physical inspection and observation, the auditors, they time to time physically inspect, right? Wherever the hardware is there, for example, server rooms and other places, just to ensure as to whether the proper temperature is there, humidity and everything like that. Now you're going to raise question, what is that? Why the temperature needs to be checked? Why the humidity levels? Security protocols, we understand, ma'am. That is totally clear to us. But what about this temperature and humidity? Now I'd like to throw another example in this very particular context. Okay, let's talk about a banking company. So if we talk about the banking company, so there are server rooms which are separate. And these server rooms always need to be in a chilled environment, because because the systems, the server, they gets heated up, and the whole, obviously data is at stake, right? So temperature, humidity levels, so they are ought to be maintained, especially in the server rooms, especially from the perspective of a banking company. There you go. And obviously, internal auditors play a very crucial role when it comes to a banking company. This was another example. Let's talk about one more thing: access controls and authentication. Obviously, it becomes the responsibility of the auditors to check about as to whosoever is having an authorization, only that person is given access after proper authentication, for example, by setting up a ID password or by any kind of PIN code or something like that, right? So that the information of the organization, that is the data, which is an oxygen for every entity, right? It is not at stake. The competitor doesn't get that information to take the undue privilege of that. Apart from this, if you talk about your company, so especially the godowns and all, so there is a separate system of, because there are lots of stock for a trading company, there are separate godowns, so biometric system, passwords, so proper authentication is there. So is that the responsibility of an internal auditor? So the answer is yes. And whatever the system is installed, the hardware system, whether that works properly or not. Because if we talk about the workstations input and output, so the hardware, that's why I emphasized again and again, hard input plus output plus hardware control. I repeat, input, output, and hardware controls. So the hardware controls which are associated with the proper authentication, authorization, so they need to be cross-checked by the internal auditor and his team there too. Besides this, there are some other few instances. If we talk about the security monitoring and incident response, obviously, being in the capacity of an auditor, you need to review the logs, monitoring system that capture your incidents, for example, CCTV cameras and all, right? Time to time, you can, on a sample basis, you can take a look and check the entry cases associated with that. Apart from this, the data protection and backup, where the backup is taken from time to time just to ensure the operations of the organization, they do not get halted. And apart from this, the compliances, the proper documentation, reports, maintenance of hardware is really very essential. If we talk about the internal auditor, it becomes his responsibility, because it's not like that you have installed your hardware once and it will function properly for a continuous basis. There might be a possibility it needs to be fixed up because of any bug in the software or because of any failure or malfunctioning of the hardware there too. So that becomes the responsibility even of an internal auditor. So how this thing can be done? We have emphasized on this thing again and again. Okay, it becomes a responsibility of the internal auditor, but how come? Obviously, if we talk about the internal auditor, he can interview the users of the organization, right? He can ask the questions directly from them, how the system is functioning, and other areas, with the help of which he can make direct questions, whether open questions or closed questions. Do you understand the difference between the open questions and the closed questions? If you talk about the open questions, so that means you can give any answer as per your own comfort level. If you talk about the closed questions, that means the answer is confined, whether yes, no, or whatever option is stipulated, you need to answer accordingly, confining to that. So obviously, an internal auditor can ask and interview the users of the hardware and the software system in that very particular entity of the organization for which the internal audit is being carried out. Apart from another thing which is associated with this, with the workstations, you have to compare the actual downtime with the normal expectations. Okay, we can incorporate one example even over here. For example, it is expected that obviously, you know, an organization should function, the hardware system or the softwares or the other hardware system controls, they should function for more than 40 hours as such properly. If there is a downtime of 1 or 2 hours, so at least 40 hours for sure, the system should function properly so that the operations can be streamlined without any halt. But on an actual note, because the server is down, employees are sitting idle, and so the actual downtime is more than that, and it is less than 40. Let's say 35 hours are worked by a particular employee in a week. So you need to compare this just to ensure whatever pay scale is given by the company to the employees, so they are not idle, the downtime is less, and this is not actually confined within the entity. For example, you are an organization and you have your, as such, operations. Let's take another key example. The one is we studied from the perspective of the entity. The employees, they are not sitting idle. Okay, cool. Understood. Another key aspect is that even this, another example, let's say that organization is carrying out its sale operations via online mode. So if the server is down, site is down most of the time, so how can the customers place an order, right? So there is a lag, or there is a server downtime. So obviously it needs to be identified by the internal auditor. He needs to make this checking at different points of time to ensure any kind of inconsistency associated with the downtime. And this you can also review the failure logs from the reports also. Another thing, let's proceed further with respect to this. That is these days, the digital computers, they store all the information. And do you have this inquisitiveness as to how the information is actually doesn't get stored in the systems there too? It is in the form of binary format, 0 and 1, right? If we talk about a bit, it is either a 0 or 1. That's the binary code. And byte is a group of bits. So that means if there are too many zeros or too many ones, so it becomes a byte. And commonly, a byte is a group of 8 bits. It may be a number, a letter, a symbol, question mark, any special character. Now, whatever we are going to study just now, super duper important from the perspective of MCQ, field and record. If we talk about the field, it is a data item. That means a group of bytes. I repeat one more time. Be quick along with me. Bit is either a 0 or 1. Byte is a group of 8 bits, right? And if we talk about field, it is a group of bytes. For example, here, the name gets reflected, Paul Hintermith. So P at the backend operations, in the as such, if we talk about the algorithm of the computer, it had to be either 0 or 1. And by combining certain bytes, a field gets stipulated at the front end, right? But at the back end, in the system, in the algorithm of the system, it is either a group of bytes only. So there are so many bits, 0 and 1, which together make a special arrangement to give the field. And if we talk about the record, it is a group of fields. So if there are many fields, so it is referred to as record. So file is a group of records. So there are 3 things: field, record, and file. What these are referred to as field, record, and file. Field, record, and file. Field is what? Field is particularly a group of bytes. Record is a group of fields. And file is a group of records. If there are too many records, it together makes a file, right? So the smallest character is a bit, either a 0 or 1. Combination of 8 bits is a byte. Combination of bytes is a field. Combination of fields is a record. Combination of too many fields is a record, and combination of records is a file. Super duper important from MCQ perspective. Let's proceed further with respect to this. Next comes electronic data interchange. What does that mean? If there is a communication of documents electronically from one computer or one organization to another one, from one organization to another, electronically, the information is shared for the documents and as such, it is referred to as electronic data interchange. If the data is communicated electronically in layman terms, from one organization to another, it is electronic data interchange. For example, you are ordering goods from a supplier, and obviously you are transferring funds, because of which the supplier is going to, give you the goods. So before EFT, that is electronic fund transfer, before EFT, electronic data interchange is the first step in the evolution of e-commerce business, right? Only the information is first electronically shared. Only after that, the operations are carried out. Now, these things are quite easy. If we talk about the advantages of electronic data interchange, obviously the errors, especially the clerical errors, they get reduced and the speed is at an optimum level. Low cost, low errors, speed is maximum, and there are no clerical tasks which are also out to be done on a conventional manual basis. Even invoices can be sent automatically, right? So these are some of the privileges of electronic data interchange, which is actually the first step of the electronic business. But there are some disadvantages as well, because it cannot handle a large volume of custom orders, because the standardization, the proper arrangement, proper organization is required, right? Proper organizing all the particularly orders. We are not saying it cannot handle too many orders. It can handle large volume of orders. But here we are emphasizing on it cannot handle a large volume of custom orders, which are tailored as per the requirements of a particular customer, right? Because there is no standardization as such, and there is unacceptable cost. The cost gets increased. So after electronic data interchange, there comes EFT, electronic fund transfer. This is basically a service which is provided by most of the banking companies and financial institutions in this contemporary era, wherein the cost is much lower than the manual system because there is no human intervention involved. You can just simply, by using certain applications, transfer the funds electronically. For example, direct deposit of payroll checks in the employees' accounts, automatic withdrawal of payments for paying your utility bills, and check collection. So these are few of the instances with respect to electronic fund transfer, because of which our life has been made easy because of EFT. We have discussed so far about, workstation, how they are important from the perspective of an auditor, then obviously how he can interview certain persons in the organization, then field, group, field, record, and file, which are as such dependent on bit and bytes, then EDI and EFT. Now let's proceed further. Data governance. It basically focuses on the information system and information technology. Be quick. Whenever we talk about governing the data, you need to keep two things in your mind. Come on, one more time with me. Information system and information technology. So that means information, data. If you talk about data, process data is the information, right? So you need to keep two terms in your mind, system and technology. So there has to be a proper system, there has to be proper technology. So data governance focus on information system and information technology. So they are very important to ensure the successful implementation of the organization strategy so that the business needs can be fulfilled there too. Now, as per the Institute of Internal Auditor Global Technology Audit Guide, which is particularly related to the information technology. And can I ask you again this question? Just focus. Data governance includes what? Information technology and information communication. Here we are talking about information technology, right? So the Institute of Internal Auditor Global Technology Audit Guide, particularly relatable to the information technology control. So that means it's the management, it's the board of directors and internal auditor who altogether are the important persons involved in the information technology controls, right? Let's talk about any organization. They generally develop strategy at three different levels: the corporate level, the topmost level, then the business level, and then the lower or the functional level strategy. Obviously, if we'll talk about the top level or the corporate level, the things are quite different. In business level, obviously the strategies for the fulfillment of organizational strategies, objectives, goals. And if you talk about the functional level, so the human resources, information system, operations, everything needs to be carried out by the senior most person through the functional team members. Let's talk about some of the MCQs. These are just for your reference, just to check how attentive you are. But obviously, there are lots and lots of MCQs in another portal of our institute for the purpose of doing practice of MCQ. So of the following, the greatest advantage of a database architecture is what? Data redundancy can be reduced, obviously. Another, an inventory clerk using a computer terminal. He is viewing the following on screen: part description, quantity in order, quantity in hand. This is what? These are all lots and lots of what? Fields. So these are records. Which of the following is the elementary unit of a data storage to represent individual attributes of an entity? So the smallest one is the field. Field is preceded by, the group of fields is what? Record. And group of records is files, right? Now let's talk about some of the strategic drivers, the facilitating or the influencing factors for the success or the failure of any organization. It's the technology and customer relationship management, how you manage your customers and what kind of technology is being used by you. So if we talk about a governance program to be proper functional, it should emphasize on the strategic alignment, that is effectiveness, risk, governance, risk and compliance. Risks need to be managed, proper value addition, and the whosoever is associated with the organization directly or indirectly, the stakeholders, employers, shareholders, everybody needs to be given value for their efforts, and particularly the performance measurement as to how and as to whether IT has accomplished its set of goals as per the prevailing standards of the industry or not. And whenever we talk about performance measurement, it always includes effectiveness, efficiency, and economy. What does it include? Performance, effectiveness, efficiency, particularly efficiency and economy. Further talking about the Institute of Internal Auditor, it has categorized the important components of IT governance into several parts. The first one is the processes, which actually serve as a base so that in all the areas of the organization, services are rendered. And obviously the hierarchical structure of the organization. Come on, one more time: processes and structure. Apart from this, the mechanism, the kind of methodology, and obviously the human resources of the organization ought to be managed effectively. So whenever we talk about successful IT governance, so the IT process, hierarchical structure, methodology, and human resources all together play a crucial role. In the end of this lecture, before wrapping up, let's talk about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance software. Basically, it helps the organization to manage the governance program strategy. G stands for governance, R for risk, C for compliance, right? That means assistance needs to be given to the management to review the policy, monitor it from time to time, to ensure whatever the guidelines are there as per the legal framework, they're complied with. The laws and the regulations are abided by. Risk is properly managed. It is monitored from time to time. And if there is any additional requirement for additional internal controls, they are levied. And obviously, the role of each and every individual at the managerial level is clearly defined with respect to controlling and mitigating the risk, lessening it, reducing it. In the end, whatever the cascade of information throughout the organization is there, it should improve the various functions. That means information transfer, cascading of information is actually referred to as when the information is communicated from the topmost level to the lower level. So it has to be in proper order so that the core essence of the information which is ought to be delivered gets delivered in the same way as it was ought to be delivered by the top level managerial person of the organization. So this was our first lecture associated with the workstations and the database. Now you are supposed to do at least 40 MCQ from mock test series 1. Thank you so much. Keep working hard and shine one day. Thank you.